So yes, we were just talking about the state's agenda for this site in the context of a comparison between Hong Kong and Singapore, and of course post-independence in particular. Well, so pre the split from Malaysia, Singapore clearly had a nation-building agenda that was tied to this site, whereas that doesn't exist in Hong Kong. But what about the sort of bottom-up drive behind the creation of this memorial? What meaning does it have for the Chinese community in particular in Singapore, and how was it used? How was it used when it was set up, and how is it used today?
Well, first of all, we probably need to remember that this is not just a national memorial, it is also a gravesite of sorts. Because we were talking about the human remains that were uncovered during construction works in the early 1960s earlier. And what they did with the remains is they unearthed them and put them into several hundred urns that then were buried under this site that is right behind us. So it does have a certain significance for the families, for instance, of those who were killed, because they now got a proper resting place, a centralized resting place for them.
Right, and of course right in the center of this memorial, although we can't see it from this angle, is an urn,
That's
which
right.
I suppose symbolizes all the remains that are... Yeah.
No, that's right.
So, in a sense, this site has, I suppose we could say, religious significance for those who lost relatives in Sukching, and for the Chinese community in particular.
Yeah.
How has that manifested itself? How was it manifested in the 1960s when the monument was created, and what's changed since then?
So if we look at some of the practices that are being held at this memorial, the 15th of February, the fall of Singapore, is the actual memorial day that was chosen by the state, where the public remembrance ceremonies are being held here. But if you actually look, for instance, at the photographs that are being taken and have been taken throughout the 60s and up until this day, probably a little less today. But especially in the beginning, it strikes you that you find, for instance, Chinese women who've lost their husbands during the massacres or during the Japanese occupation in general, burning incense at this memorial, so performing certain Chinese ritual practices of mourning that are, of course, not tailored to the state's agenda of commemorating all ethnicities equally.
Well, it's a key thing of the Civilian War Memorial being on the state's agenda, isn't it? I mean, to try to make it something that all Singaporeans can actually relate to. So what they've done is, yes, they have a section there that actually allows people to actually burn joss sticks, so in line with the Chinese rituals of commemorating the dead.
Right.
But you also have, every year, a multi-religious ceremony, where you have representatives from all the different religions in Singapore coming together, saying their prayers in their own languages.
Yes.
And in that sense, it's an attempt to try to get people to come down regardless of what your ethnicity is. And what's interesting is that is actually the first time in Singapore where you actually have that, because previously ceremonies tend to be at the Kranji War Memorial, which was set up by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And that was very Christian-centric, very in terms of its rituals.
Yeah.
This was something that's quite set apart from that.
But from the sound of it, quite regimented, that ceremony? Quite the multi-religious ceremonies that take place. These are the format of the ceremony is.
Use the word regimented, but I would say it is choreographed.
Choreographed is a better word, yes.
So these people come down, and it really does allow all these different groups to come down. But it is interesting that given the basis of this place as being mainly the Chinese in the urns underneath, you do really see a lot of Chinese coming down compared to some of the other ethnic
Still
groups.
today.
And because it is also part of total defense,
Total national defense.
Total Defense Day, you also have representatives from schools, representatives from different government agencies coming down.
Right.
to the
So we're kind of
ceremony.
getting back to this is still the state's agenda, or the
it
state is choreographing
it
all
is
of this.
definitely. But
But-
having said that, you do have also war veterans and people who have actually gone through the war
Yes.
come down.
Yes.
And I think for them, it goes beyond the state's agenda. For
Yes.
them, it is really a way to try to commemorate what happened to them
Right.
in the past.